Osio, Dirani Lasti, Kelly Hallman Dawado, Chichaladi. Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Kelly Hallman. I'm the founder and director of Indigenous Justice Circle. Native American protocol dictates that at official gatherings, we start with a prayer. So I will offer one now to get us started in a good way. Creator, we are grateful for this day and to those who have joined us either in person or online. We thank you for the privilege of being together to share our stories. We ask that you help each of us interact with patience, empathy, and a full heart. We pray for the safety and well-being of those in this room and around the world who are facing hardships, large and small. We wish to honor our ancestors and elders whose sacrifices made our physical, cultural, and spiritual lives possible. Help us be even half of what they were and to be guided by them. We ask these things humbly and with thanks. Nazgego Nigalsht. I'll turn the floor over now to Callie Pettigrew.
Hi, my name is Callie Pettigrew. I am an enrolled Cherokee Nation citizen from Oklahoma. Welcome to the event. Many non-Indigenous organizations start their meeting with a land acknowledgement statement, but today we want to specifically acknowledge modern-day thriving Lenape people. We are holding this event in the traditional ancestral homelands of the Munsee, Lenape, and Wappinger people who had thriving and healthy communities before the Dutch came to stole their land in 1626. History books say that Manhattan was purchased by the Dutch rather than purchasing of land that led to dispossession and death among the Lenape people. This was the first of a long history of forced removal this Native American and other Indigenous people have faced. Let us acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from this territory. As these words are spoken and heard, Indigenous Justice Circle and its partners are working to raise awareness and strengthen ties of modern-day Lenape and Delaware nations to their traditional homelands. Awareness of Indigenous exclusion and erasure, past and present, is critically important. Indigenous Justice Circle is committed to working to overcome these effects in our programs, convenings, and research. Modern-day Lenape and Delaware Nation have rich cultures that cherish Mother Earth by respecting their land we live on and nurturing it to remain healthy. We wish to acknowledge present-day Lenape and Delaware people who are creating meaningful impact, changing perceptions, and guiding future generations.
Thank you so much, Callie. So Callie is one of our Indigenous Young Leaders, a program that we have at Indigenous Justice Circle. And she's just finishing her MPH at Columbia. And she told me that she just got a job. She's a cancer she is like out doing great things. She's also helping us with some data work too. So she's so good at so many things. So we're thrilled to have her here and the other young Indigenous leaders in the room, who some of them will speak. Others, I think, will join us in speaking up during the Q&A. So you may have heard of the Trail of Tears. The Indian Removal Act was passed in 1830. Despite the Cherokee Nation's many efforts to fight it, including 2 Supreme Court cases that ruled in our favor, we were removed from our land. I want to tell you of the experience of just one set of my ancestors who are on this trail. The 5 Killers lived in Crawfish Town, Georgia. At the orders of Winfield Scott, they were forced in 1838 to abandon their land, dwellings, animals, and other possessions, and then were put into internment camps. Later that year, Cherokees were marched west in 16 groups of 1,000 people each. The 5 killers were among the 2 earliest groups who experienced the highest rates of mortality, being forced at bayonet point by the US Army during a summer of extreme heat and drought. Before the roundup, the 5 killer family was 11 strong: 1 man, 1 woman, 2 boys, and 7 girls. After 3 months and 800 arduous miles, the Army muster roll taken near Indian Territory, which is modern-day Oklahoma, showed the family had only 9 members who lost their lives along the way. The demographic record showed that it was 2 adolescent girls. This is not an isolated incident, but reflects a pattern across time. These girls, no doubt, during an unspeakably difficult journey, carried their baby sisters, searched for wood for campfires each night, foraged for berries and acorns to supplement meager, rotting food rations supplied by the US Army, and collected what water was to be found. The story of teenage girls sacrificing for the physical and emotional well-being of younger and older members of their families is repeated over and over again to this day. We see it in conflict settings around the world. We see it in the missing and murdered Indigenous women's and girls' two-spirit crisis across Indian country. Women are referred to as the backbone in Native communities. It would better serve all members of Indigenous communities to have a business plan to invest in their girls to strengthen that backbone. I started Indigenous Justice Circle with the aim of strengthening Indigenous-led organizations to more systematically reach Indigenous girls who, due to a long list of settler colonial assimilation policies over time, which we'll get to during the Q&A period, they are at risk for unfavorable outcomes at very young ages. At the request of and in partnership with tribal communities and urban Indian health providers, we offer an Indigenous design blueprint for revitalizing intergenerational matrilineal support systems and cultural lifeways. These investments are foundational to democracy, inclusion, and renewal of Native American communities. Our goal is to equip a new generation of Indigenous girls, young women, and two-spirit people to influence health, economic, education, and political system for the benefit of their communities. We hope you will join us in this movement. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I feel very lucky to be here. My name is Marianne McCune. I'm a longtime public radio journalist and the founder of a youth radio program here in New York called Radio Rookies. And I'm here because I've spent the best parts of my career helping young people find and use the power of their voices. And so I'm a huge fan of all of the speakers that you're going to hear from today. And I'm your moderator. So it's a real honor to be here. I'm just going to give you a quick summary of our program. We're going to start by hearing from a wonderful lineup of Indigenous leaders and people working to help foster leadership in the Indigenous communities around the world. You can learn more about each of them on our list of speakers. And then we'll get to spend a little time in conversation with Dr. Kelly Hallman and learn about the work of Indigenous Justice Circle, as well as with Angel del Valle. Angel is the representative of Population Council in Guatemala, and also was with the group Abriendo Oportunidades, or Opening Opportunities. It's a program focused on empowering Indigenous girls and adolescents in Guatemala, and he's going to come up and welcome you right now.
Thank you. So it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this event on the sidelines of the 23rd session of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, which builds on the foundations of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We start this event by acknowledging the intergenerational movements of women that have led to meaningful change, particularly in Guatemala, which is a very special and unique territory where half of the population is indigenous, and yet women have to stand up and fight for their rights every day, indigenous women in particular. During this event, you'll hear directly from people that are now in the movements. So youth, indigenous youth from different places across the Americas. Indigenous youth that are supporting their communities, taking a step forward to reclaim the intergenerational connections that have been disrupted by the legacy of the colonial institutions that prevail in education, in health, recreation, in land ownership, you name it. Last year reports on the 22nd session of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues brings attention to the alarming reports of criminalization and killings of Indigenous women and Two-Spirit youth as a direct result of defending their lands and resources. In Guatemala, we experience that as a daily threat to the defense of identity, to the rights of Indigenous women, girls, and youth. And it is a crime that speaks to the very essence of self-determination of the rising generation of Indigenous girls in particular. The Permanent Forum welcomed and endorsed the General Recommendation number 39 on the rights of Indigenous women and girls on the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, which provides critical guidance to the states on their obligations to enforce the specific mechanisms, social protection mechanisms that are supposed to offer protection to Indigenous girls and their communities. And that is a message that we want to be very intentional about today. The report also recognizes that the discrimination and violence disproportionately affect Indigenous women and girls worldwide are intersectional, based on factors including sex, gender, socioeconomic status, livelihoods, origin, identity, ethnicity, race, language, disability, and other factors. The report also brings attention to the fact that its girls and women are inextricably linked to their peoples, to their lands, to their territories, to the natural resources, to the culture. So today, we want to bring attention to the critical role that Indigenous youth, particularly girls, women, Two-Spirit youth, play in realizing the rights, not only for their collective sense of community, but also for the future generation of Indigenous girls. The realization of collective rights of Indigenous women and girls depends on the urgent need to invest in the spaces for these girls to learn, to play, to have access to health, to services, to justice, in following and in accordance to their own self-determination, which is critical for states to understand. Colonial institutions still drive racism relevant in all of the domains of lives for girls, and we hope that today you get to hear this critical perspective, not only of how there's resilience, on how there is strength, but also how there's innovation, creativity, and also a very intentional and powerful voice of the rising generation of Indigenous girls in the US, across us, and the places that we work, trying to build this movement of Indigenous girls. So on behalf of the Indigenous Justice Circle and the Population Council, we welcome you. We appreciate your time, both those that are here in person and online. Thank you.
Thank you, Angel. I look forward to hearing more from you. And now I'm excited to introduce Hannah McGlade, who is Noongar First Nation from Western Australia. She's a human rights lawyer and a professor with a focus on Aboriginal legal issues, and she's been pivotal in the return of historically significant lands and the establishment of services for Aboriginal victims of domestic and family violence. Thank you so much for coming, Hannah. Here you are. Hi, hello everyone, and it's great to be here. Thank you, Kelly, for inviting me. When I
first made contact with you and you're heading to our country as well. And I learned about your girls' programs. I was really excited and excited to be here and have this connection. So thank you very much. And we do need very strong girls' Indigenous movements and investments in our country. We have some work I've been involved in over a course of 5 years has been to promote a better attention from the federal government to the issue of violence against Aboriginal women, which impacts young women and girls at particularly severe rates, including sexual assault. Using the UN system and seeing advice from the Committee on the Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women to Canada, from the advocacy of Indigenous women for a separate national action plan dedicated to Indigenous women and girls, we have now achieved this outcome in Australia with our first dedicated plan and National Committee of Indigenous Women overseeing the development of that work. So this engagement internationally and collaboration is really so important for us. I'm currently also working on a project towards the Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women called Seven Sisters, and it will be the first use of the optional protocol mechanism from our country, and it will be relaying to the UN Expert Committee the cases of 7 murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls in Australia, so that we can highlight, in fact, the nature of the systemic violence, including from the criminal justice system, underlined by the lack of supports for Indigenous girls. We do have programs, some for Indigenous girls, but it has been noted that there's much more for Indigenous boys, and our calls for gender lens in Indigenous affairs have not yet been heard by our government, so we're going to be continuing to raise that issue. I'm with the United Nations Permanent Forum from the Pacific region, and I studied international human rights law a long time ago now, and I didn't really see the recognition of the rights of women and girls in UN law, sadly, while I was a law student. It took a long time, the UN, to turn its mind to the rights of Indigenous women and girls, and that's because the focus was on collective rights. Women and girls' rights were seen as individual rights, unfortunately. But this is changing, and we have had several important initiatives which I'll just let you know about in recent years. Firstly, though, we did have an expert group meeting in 2012, our body, the Permanent Forum on the Rights of Indigenous People. And so that body also issued a report on the issue of violence against Indigenous women. Article 22(2) of the Declaration itself says states shall take measures in conjunction with Indigenous people to ensure that Indigenous women and children enjoy the full protection and guarantees against all forms of violence and discrimination. That's very important. We've also had a significant report by the Special Rapporteur on Violence, focusing on violence against Indigenous women and girls. I do recommend that report. Special Rapporteur Reem Al-Salam found that Indigenous women and girls face grave, systematic and continuous acts of violence that permeate every aspect of their lives, while perpetrators are enjoying alarming levels of impunity. This violence is rooted in historic and unequal patriarchal power structures, racism, exclusion and marginalisation enabled by a legacy of colonialism. The level of impunity that perpetrators, both state and non-state actors, enjoy is alarming, and the scale and seriousness of violence experienced by Indigenous women and girls are inadequately reflected in data collection, legislation or public policies. And although the rights of Indigenous women and girls to be free from violence is enshrined in international law, this has not materialised into effective prevention and protection measures by the states, the Special Rapporteur said. This report also highlights good practices and challenges to the access of justice and support services. Indigenous women and girls experience systematic discrimination, accessing non-Indigenous and Indigenous justice systems, and confront major barriers in accessing justice. It called on states to review the interplay of laws between the nation state and Indigenous communities to ensure violence is prevented. Legal grey zones on human rights accountability of non-state actors contributes to promoting violence against Indigenous women and girls. Where violence occurs, it must be addressed effectively to end impunity that exists for these crimes, Al-Salam said. This violence occurs with the full knowledge and often the tacit agreement and support of states. This important report also provides recommendations for states and other stakeholders to implement policy and legal reform that will protect the right of Indigenous women and girls to a life free from violence. Indigenous women and girls must be entitled to full, equal and effective participation that goes beyond lip service and sees them as resilient actors rather than only as survivors of violence. You might also be aware that the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women made their first recommendation on the issue of the rights of Indigenous women and girls just in the last year, General Recommendation 39, which is fantastic. And I believe the South American Indigenous women were particularly involved in leading advocacy for this recommendation over some years. I'll let you look at the CEDAW recommendation at your own time, but just to emphasise really that we are seeing an important shift under international law to recognise the rights of women and girls, and I'm just very happy to be here and to connect and learn about this important work that you're doing. It's certainly something that we'd like to highlight to our Australian government, and so I'd like to keep in contact. I do have to be back at the forum before the 3 o'clock commences. So, I'll be here. So thank you.
How are people hearing us, everyone? It could be a little louder. Okay, so as any speakers who come up here, please speak up. And on Zoom, are people able to hear? Okay. Great. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you so much. Our next speaker couldn't be here in person, so she's joining us by video. Elizabeth Vasquez is Maya Quiche. She's a senior mentor and national coordinator with Abriendo Oportunidades in Guatemala, and where she co-founded a network of Indigenous women who mentor Indigenous girls and adolescents. She has also represented Population Council at events focusing on civic participation in Colombia and El Salvador, and here she is.
Abriendo Oportunidades es un programa centrado en niñas y adolescentes en áreas rurales de Guatemala. Surge hace más de 20 años. El programa provee habilidades para la vida y ayuda a transformar su realidad. A lo largo de los años, Abriendo Oportunidades ha sido una fuerza de cambio, trabajando para reducir la prevalencia de matrimonios infantiles, la migración y el trabajo infantil. El núcleo del programa radica en su enfoque integral, razón por la cual las mentoras y tutoras comunitarias tienen un rol activo, guiando, motivando y acompañando a las niñas y adolescentes a mantenerse en la escuela, informándoles sobre sus derechos, incluso los sexuales y reproductivos, por medio de sesiones semanales con una currícula culturalmente pertinente que desarrolla habilidades para la vida, habilidades de comunicación y herramientas para cuestionar las normas tradicionales de género. Las mentoras comunitarias realizan alianzas con autoridades comunitarias, autoridades municipales, centros educativos, padres y madres de familia. El rol de las mentoras es tan importante, sin embargo, es desfinanciado por el gobierno y las organizaciones que financian los programas para niñas, adolescentes y juventudes. Aunque las mentoras tienen vocación de servicio social, porque ha sido históricamente en las comunidades, también están en búsqueda continua de oportunidades para las opciones de empleo, ya que para ellas son limitadas. Por ello, Abriendo Oportunidades invierte en mentoras indígenas entre las edades de 18 a 25 años, quienes coordinan los espacios seguros con los clubes de niñas y adolescentes que les permiten consolidarse como agentes de cambio en la comunidad. Abriendo Oportunidades eleva las voces de las mentoras, jóvenes, adolescentes y niñas con quienes trabajan en espacios comunitarios, nacionales e internacionales. En el marco del Foro Permanente de Pueblos Indígenas de las Naciones Unidas, hacemos el eco del tema para elevar las voces de las juventudes, enfatizando inversión en niñas y adolescentes en oportunidades de educación, la recreación y fortalecimiento personal.
Help bring a little bit of this beauty into the room. Our next speaker is an inaugural member of the Indigenous Justice Circle's Young Leaders cohort. River Webb is Nez Perce and Sac and Fox. They are a traditional ribbon work artist, renowned two-spirit powwow dancer, and they're also a grad student in geochemistry at Cornell University. Their work connects traditional arts to Native movements, land recovery, tribal sovereignty, and the reclamation of treaty rights. River serves as this year's ambassador for the International Two-Spirit Council. Thank you for being here, River. Come on up.
Data lang ay kaloy na manig dress wa mo pa ya data to katempe ho wa we can find a dash is nema oiso. Let's see, can y'all hear me? My name's River, and like I said, I come from the Bear clan of Meskwaki people, and it's pretty easy to remember our last name because we're the Bear family in the Bear clan. So if you ever are on Meskwaki territory and you see that last name, that's my family. And I think it's really important to talk about that last name and what that means to be part of a clan, because in our Meskwaki way, even though the clans come from men, it's from that reason that men have nothing else to give a child. A woman provides everything else. The only thing a man can give at that time is his clan. And so in our way, we teach that because our matrilineal leaders are going to be there to lift up each of those children and teach them their clan ways and bring them into Benegan. But it's the man, that's all he can offer, is that clan. But I'll get sidetracked on that forever. I'm very big about stories. I am enrolled with Nez Perce tribe of Idaho, but I'm also Meskwaki. I'm also Potawatomi and Odawa. And I'm this year's International Two-Spirit Ambassador. So I got that title from Wabanaki Two-Spirit Alliance at the International Gathering in 2023. And my role has been just traveling around Indian country and going back even to my own community and just serving as a face, because it's important that people see us in community. A lot of the times people like me are pushed to the sidelines or not acknowledged or ostracized. And for myself, I come from a very small community. We're only a couple thousand people, I think 2,000 right now. And I knew that when I made this choice and, when I was asked by the elder women in my community to step up and start dancing as a woman and live my life as a woman, there were a couple things I had to take seriously. And one of them was that I'm not going to hide. And so when I came back with my royalty title to the Meskwaki Nation in Tama, Iowa, I made sure that I was there and I was proud. And so that's me on the royalty panel for Meskwaki Nation. And, it was a powerful experience to be regarded and acknowledged by everyone there and be seen as who I am, which is Manitopaiwak. That's our word. Two-spirit is a very, very broad brush term. I spent some time with some of the elders who were there when that word was created, specifically Beverly Little Thunder from Standing Rock tribe. And she shared a little bit about that. And one of the things that she shared was, we had no idea the word was going to stick. They didn't know it was going to last that long, They thought, oh, this is going to last a couple of years maybe, and then they'll be on to something else. Because before that, it was GAI, Gay American Indians, or GAI. And they didn't know it was going to stick. But again, it's that placeholder. The idea is consistent. I've always been Manitopaiwak, and that word is always going to stay in our language and in our culture. And what that means is changed woman. I've been reflecting a lot on that because when I first started dancing as a woman, and there's a lot of things to enjoy. I feel more myself, and I get to wear traditional clothing and these things, but that's not what it is to be a woman. It's not just clothes. And so my aunt, she kind of grabbed onto me and looked me in the eyes, and she said, it's not just about clothing, it's not wearing pretty things, but you have to commit to your community and be of service. To be a woman is to be of service to others unconditionally. To be manitopaywak means that when people call for you, you have to be there. And that's what I've tried to do. So when my grandpa was going through his dying time, I was there. And when elders call for me, I show up. And when people ask me to cook for a feast, that's what it means to be manitopaywak. It's not just, it's not just getting to have these moments of joy and getting to fight and be an advocate, but it's also being there in those times when your community needs someone to care for them and needs someone to show them love. And Indigenous Justice Circle has helped me with that in every step of the way for this past year. So some of the lessons that I've learned have been, our presence is needed and valued, right? When I showed up and I showed my face at Meskwaki Powwow, so many parents came up to me and, told me, my child wants to dance like you do, but they're afraid. And so I know I wasn't going to let that happen. So I've been working on regalia for those people who came up to me and were brave enough to speak. And I'm working on a video series with my tribe that's going to be educating not only our own community, but people outside of our community about what it means to be Two-Spirit, because in Iowa, it's not a very trans-friendly place. That voice needs to be heard, not just within our community, but outside of it. Secondly, we're watched by our elders, and that was something that was really beautiful for me. Is I had elders who I had known my whole life come up to me and say, I don't know if you knew this, but I'm Two-Spirit. I had one come up to me and say, oh, I have a husband. And that just, it meant a lot to know that I wasn't just having safety for youth, but for elders to come up and talk to me in that way and, express things that maybe no one in their community wanted to talk about. Or, it was a shameful thing to express, to live that double life. And finally, voices change circles and make them more complete. And that's the reason why I put that photo of me dancing jingle up there. There's a lot of, unfortunately, in our community, bioessentialism is a good way to put it. Our traditional gender roles have been really impacted. And unfortunately, they try to keep Two-Spirit people and trans people from our places in ceremony and from dancing dances like jingle. And that's a really big issue right now. If you want to know how to help people like me, it's understanding that we need to keep asserting our place in community and our space, because unfortunately, there are people who like to co-opt and twist our traditions and say, oh, Two-Spirit people aren't allowed in this space, aren't allowed to dance, aren't allowed to do this or that. And it's something that really needs to be combated in Indian country. But I'll return back to that clan system as we finish. And I just want to say all of this has been possible by the women who made me, my aunts, the people in Indigenous Justice Circle, people who have been my mentors. And it's because of that clan system and that matrilineal fostering. All I was able to get from my family was, I have my Bear clan. That's the one thing that I get. But that gives me the community of women who raised me, my aunts, my grandmothers. And the people in Indigenous Justice Circle are no exception. They've taught me so much this year and helped me as I've been on this journey, providing resources and showing me the way, giving me that encouragement to make sure I go up and speak out at big things. Because of the royalty title that I have, I'll be going to Gathering of Nations later this month. And going there and making sure I represent Two-Spirit people is really important, so that I can show my face. And those big jumbotrons and those photos of all the royalty, I'll get to stand next to all the other, well-acknowledged royalty, like Miss Indian World and things like that, and have that same recognition. And yeah, that's really important. Debbie, thank you.
Thank you so much, River. And also River will be leading us in the making of corn husk dolls after the program. And so I hope everybody can stay back. It sounds so fun. Before we turn to our Q&A with Kelly and Angel, our final speaker is a member of the Upper Cayuga Turtle Clan. Kashmir Bowser is also an accomplished graduate of Buffalo State University in anthropology and Indigenous studies. She has focused on food sovereignty and has researched the intersection of US racism and the undervalue of Indigenous beadwork. She's the Niagara County Clubhouse Manager at Native American Community Services. Welcome, Kashmir.
There you go. Everyone hear me? Okay. Kashmir ni gyalso gayokono ni wakonzonte kenyate ni wageshote. As previously said, my name is Kashmir. I am Upper Cayuga Turtle Clan of 6 Nations. My pronouns are she, her. I am the Niagara County Clubhouse Manager at Native American Community Services in Niagara County, New York. So I'm going to be discussing our girls program a little bit and how we are helping our girls come home through intergenerational matrilineal support. And so the framework when I was working on this presentation is we're going to do kind of a past, present, and future. We're going to look at the past to see what our foundation is, the present to see what we're currently doing, and then hopefully the values that we can give these girls for the future. Sorry. So cosmology stories are really important to any people or culture. They help you understand what your place is in the world and then the values that you hold, whether we know it or not. And that's no different for Haudenosaunee people. We have the story of Sky Woman as our foundation, as well as this idea that of Mother Earth. The Earth itself is seen as a woman and is, so the Earth itself is seen as a woman from which all things are created, and it carries new life, creates new life, and then allows us to go into the future. So with the Mother Earth and Sky Woman being the foundation of our cosmology stories, this really helps set our girls to be strong women. But that really is only the case if they know these stories and if they understand these stories and are put into context for them. So our traditional roles as women look very different from in the past versus today. So in the past, we were matrilineal and matrilocal people. Other responsibilities for the women include being responsible for the clearing. So this is the cultivation of crops and production of food. This also includes maintaining the longhouse as well as educating, caring, and the rearing of the children. There are some other decision-making processes that Haudenosaunee women played a big part in, and that includes deciding the location of new villages, deciding whether war was to be waged or not, and then the fate of captives as well. One of the things that we still have going today is our clan mothers are the ones that decide who our chiefs are. And with that comes the ability to decide, to dehorn them, to decide that if they are not fitting in the role in the way that they're supposed to, that they would no longer be chief. Down at the bottom, I put that the women also made clay pots, and that seems kind of silly out of context. And when you're looking at it as being, you know, in line with being able to decide whether war was to be waged or not, it can seem pretty menial, but it was actually really important. Haudenosaunee people depended on clay a lot when we were deciding where a village was supposed to go. If there wasn't enough clay, if there wasn't the right amount of clay, they would keep looking for a village. So it's a really important part of the everyday life. So up on the screen, I have a picture of my director's mom. Her name is Katie Wheeler. She was a girl at Thomas Indian School on the Cattaraugus Indian Reservation in New York. Like many Indigenous communities, Haudenosaunee communities were greatly impacted and forever changed by residential schools. At the most basic level, residential schools were meant to tear families apart. And by doing this, the value of women as caretakers and educators and nurturers was diminished and was undermined. So these girls went to these schools, and instead of learning how to be community members, they were taught things such as assault and guilt if they survived these ordeals and if they made it back to their home communities. This was all that they knew. They did not know how important they were to Haudenosaunee lifeways, and they did not know how to be the girls that they were meant to be. These schools attempted to strip our children of their culture, and in many ways they succeeded. Our communities are still dealing and healing with the trauma that residential schools have done against us. Many of us don't speak our language, and many of us don't know our cultural norms and values. So whether or not our girls today have ever stepped foot in a residential school, they are still impacted by what was done. So knowing that we come from strong women and knowing that colonization attempted to wipe that out, why is our girl society important? So like us, many of our girls were raised in a patriarchal society with little knowledge of the power that they hold as women. They are not taught that being a girl is enough of a reason to demand respect. By forming our girl society, we're hoping to give that back to them. Rematriation is the process of reclaiming our identity and helping all of us to become closer to cultural and traditional teachings in an active way in our daily lives. By having our Girl Society, we offer them a safe space to explore what it means to be Haudenosaunee and to build community with each other. In this space, we are helping these girls to be proud to be Haudenosaunee women. So looking into the future, we were trying to find ways in which we can take these traditional values and traditional roles and make them more how they can help our girls in these modern times. So the purpose of our Girl Society is to remind the girls of the strength that they have as women, as it is intrinsic to who they are as Haudenosaunee women. Our program allows us to remind our girls and to reaffirm of the women that their ancestors were and the women that they should strive to be. Because we no longer live in a pre-contact world, our values and our roles as women have changed. On the list I have there that the traditional values of clan mothers and women as mothers and nurturers. While we still certainly have clan mothers and women who are mothers and nurturers and educators, we're helping the girls to navigate a patriarchal society with values that are traditionally found in a matriarchy. So for example, by understanding that their ancestors were diplomats and clan mothers, they can understand that today they have a voice and that it matters. By understanding their ancestors were keepers of the clearing, we reaffirm their kinship ties not only to each other, but to Mother Earth and to be caretakers for Mother Earth. By understanding traditionally, we were considered equal to men. We can show our girls that we can heal the past wounds that colonization has attempted to create, and show them that we are stronger together as a community and to build a path to build that unity for all Indigenous people. We have been teaching them traditional arts and crafts. We recently did a pottery workshop. But by teaching them these things, we're showing them that they can not only express themselves, but to know that while they're part of a larger community, they're also unique individuals. And by teaching them that women were educators and mothers and nurturers, which they certainly can be if they decide to, we're teaching them how to nurture and care for each other and how to hold each other responsible for the women that they are all working towards being. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We are going to move on to have a conversation with Kelly and Angel and Indigenous Justice Circle and come on up, Population Council and Abriendo, Oportunidades. I'm going to sit and talk with them a little bit, and then we'll open it up for questions for them and for the other speakers as well. Adrian, thank you so much. And yes. Oh, we need to turn it on.
We did. How close do we need to talk about this?
First of all, I want to say thank you for your beautiful opening. I forgot to say thank you when I came up. It was a very powerful way to start. I appreciate that, and thank you, Angel, as well. I wanted to start by talking about the idea of self-determination because it is a theme of today's session. And both of your organizations are, in my mind, working on self-determination by helping young people help themselves. And Kelly, I think of you as modeling self-determination as well. And so I wanted you to start by talking a little bit about your own background, your personal background, and how it led you to start Indigenous Justice Circle.
Sure, so we don't have a lot of time, so I won't give every single detail, but I'm like Callie, originally from Oklahoma. My father was a construction worker, and so we moved every 3 or 4 months until I was 14 years old. And so I lived all over the country and saw a lot. And I am a first generation college student. We are a low income family, so I was a Pell Grant recipient, which that's the US grant to help poor families. So I sort of ended up in college by accident. I think statistically I should have gotten pregnant and dropped out of high school, but I didn't. And then, yeah, I wanted to have a degree that would help me survive if a man wasn't around, because that happens a lot in too many communities. And so I got an econ degree thinking that I could maybe survive that way. So then I went on to get a PhD and wanted to do work around the world to help women and girls. And I spent a long time doing that in Washington, DC. And then I worked here at the Pop Council for 21 years. And then I founded Indigenous Justice Circle just 2 years ago. So that's the short version.
And why? Why that last step?
Why the last step? Because with the social justice movements that were really gaining momentum, especially after George Floyd's murder and during COVID, I realized that if I wanted to work squarely in Native communities, that I needed to be in a Native-led organization. And so that was really my strong call. And I thought, if I'm going to do this, I need to take the jump now. And so, yeah, I got help from some people in this room to do that, which I'm very lucky to have allies in that regard. And yeah, so here we are.
And just one more for you. I think one of the issues that people who don't follow Native issues in this country know about is the missing and murdered women and girls. And I've heard you talk about how, well, your organization tries to look at that through the lens of history and what led to that. And so I wondered if you could talk about just some of the historical moments that have led to that terrible, I don't know, trend or, happening. And just talk about how you're working to address that history as a way of dealing with the roots of the problem.
Absolutely. So Kashmir touched on some of these things and Ruler did as well. So throughout US history, much of the policies and programs were to erase Native culture and Native ways of doing things with the goal of assimilating Indigenous people into the mainstream community. And I think that a lot of those efforts were, hoping to do good, to help Native people. It's like, if you, just get in the mainstream, then you'll be okay. But many of them actually helped harm people. I can go through a whole list of them, but just to name a few, in 1860, the Homestead Act in particular opened up a lot of Native land for white settlers to take the land. And so that was one movement toward our losing our rights to the clearing, as Kashmir was talking about. When there was no more communal land, women didn't have control over it. The Dawes Allotment Act in the early 1900s opened up reservations for white people to settle in them. And that also became much less communal, and women had much less control over collective resources as they used to. The boarding school era was another one that we've mentioned already, and the reproductive caring roles of mothers were taken away during that time. A lot of people still talk about the boarding schools as having harmed Native children to this day because we don't have the parenting skills that we used to have, because we were subjected to sexual assault, to physical beatings, to lots of other negative things. My grandfather is a survivor of the Charles H. Burke Indian Training School in New Mexico, and he talks about handcuffs and beatings that they were subject to. So yeah, it was a pretty bad time. But then also in the 1960s, there were forced adoptions of Native children to white families, because the Native way of raising children is collective, it's a community, and that was not seen as acceptable to some of the child protection officers that had jurisdiction over Native communities. And then finally in the 1970s, there were unconsented sterilizations of Native women in several Indian Health Service clinics around the country. And so they lost their reproductive decision-making and rights during that time. So it's been a whole history of policies that someone thought they were doing the right thing, but it was certainly not the right thing for Native people. So I'll stop there for now, but there's more I can say if the time permits.
Well, just how does your understanding of that history affect the tools that you use in your work?
So Native people realize that to be okay and to feel whole, they need to reclaim their cultural ways of being. So our life ways are what keep us grounded, keep us complete. And so reclaiming that culture, renewing our culture is one of the things that overlays all of the work we do. And that has to start with history. What is our culture? What did we do? What did we do as women? What did we do as girls? What did we do as boys, men? Like, what kept us going? What kept us in sync with the seasons, with the land, with things as they changed? How did we cope? And so it's really needing to go back to history to reestablish your identity, and then you feel as if you can go forward in a way that you are complete and you're not split as much between the white world and the red world. This walking two worlds really helps tear people apart internally, and so that's a really difficult thing. But feeling as if you know both sides is helpful and it's healing. And I actually had to go through that myself. And I think I had to work internationally to get away from where I came from, but then come back and feel complete again.
Thank you. Angel, you're working with, or your organizations are working with girls and adolescents in a different context in Guatemala. Can you talk about how that context and that history impacts the work that you're doing there, and why girls? Why that? Why are you working with that population?
Thank you. So I actually met Kelly working with Indigenous girls in Guatemala, and Judith and other colleagues here in the room, because 30 years ago, the world started talking about women and girls more intentionally. At the onset of the Millennium Development Goals back then, but in Guatemala, the mainstream, movements and the mainstream narrative was, very crowded, because we come from 30 years of a very obscure, intense, and harmful civil war that led to genocide. And this genocide was perpetrated by the state, by the army, against the indigenous populations. And it was because of this notion that was installed during colonial times that indigenous peoples are second-class citizens, right?
Even though they're a very large percentage of the population.
Even though they account for half of the population in modern day Guatemala, but back in the 1950s, 1960s, it was the majority of the population. The history in Guatemala is connected not only to the colonial institutions, but also to the US, actually, because of the Cold War and the fight against whatever we back then was thought to be the insurrectionists that were largely associated to the indigenous populations, actually disrupted not only the livelihoods, the minimum opportunities that indigenous people had access to, but also their representation in government. When the Spaniards came, indigenous people were seen as grants to the Spaniards, so labor. Not only that, but also they were seen as this children-like part of the population that could only get things if they were given to, right? And you would think that after a process of civil war, after a process of peace agreements that were reached in the late 1990s, society was going to make more intentional investments and promises in indigenous people, particularly in indigenous girls, right? And this is the day where the person that is most likely to be out of school in Guatemala by age 12 is an indigenous girl, right? And the research that the Population Council started doing, these amazing women that are here in the room started to actually raise attention to the fact, there was a myth back in Guatemala back then that indigenous people were not sending their children to school, right? Because they were indigenous, and it was a synonym of lack of progress and whatnot. And actually, if you look at the data, you consistently find that it's the intersection of being a girl, living in poverty, and living in isolated communities that keeps girls out of school. It's not ethnicity. So there was a big, strong, important message and lesson there that we were not being intentional about self-determination. We were not being intentional about rebuilding much of these matrilineal connections, as Kel was saying, that have been erased over and over, right? And we see that there are connections between the work in Guatemala and the work that we started doing here in the US. And to me, the message that really resonates is that these intergenerational connections, when you actually enable those to be talked about, when you name them, when you're able to connect with storytelling, with the strengths of the culture, you actually change the whole system, right? And we hope that the progress that has been made here in the US can be an inspiration to where we want to get to in Guatemala.
I'd love to hear you both talk about the impact on mental health of girls and adolescents in the communities that you're working with. I mean, these a lot of difficult to endure history, and how does that play out in girls and adolescents today?
So this Walking Two Roads, the Urban Relocation Act of 1956, enticed Native people to move to cities, and there were job promises and housing promises and other things that they were supposed to get, and they didn't get it. And most of them ended up feeling disconnected from their home communities, from their culture. And many of them didn't go back. They still live in cities, and they're still feeling torn between, who they are and, where they come from and where they're currently living. And so that's and the historical trauma of dealing with all of the loss, the lack of treaty obligations being met by the US government. I mean, those are weights that one carries, but then also in our recent history, COVID disconnected people, and that caused a mental health crisis for all young people, but especially girls. If you look at the data, girls and LGBTQ young people, I mean, their rates of wanting to kill themselves, of having suicidal idea, I mean, it's just through the roof. And data are actually quite lacking in terms of being able to break things down by gender and age and race. but Callie is helping us find data on these facts, and there are 3 states where we have been able to find that gender, age, race breakdown. In New Mexico, in North Dakota, and in Oklahoma, we find that middle school students, for girls, their rates of suicide attempts have just skyrocketed in the last 10 years. For boys, they've gone up very, very slightly. But for girls, it is through the roof. 40% of 6th through 8th grade girls in New Mexico said they thought about killing themselves in the last year. 40%. It's 15% for boys the same age, which is still terrible. But for girls, I mean, this is what it looks like in North Dakota, in New Mexico, and in Oklahoma. So we have a crisis on our hands. And this is something that this sort of collective togetherness, social support, really, we think will help quell this epidemic.
And just to be clear, these stats are for Indigenous communities or the states overall, but those states that have high populations of Indigenous.
We looked at the data for the state overall, and we were able to get the data just for the Indigenous students. Yes.
Okay. And Angel, I mean, you've already begun talking about this a little bit, and also we saw in Elizabeth's video some joyous girls in a circle, but you talked about networks. And you were talking about intergenerational networks, but maybe you can talk about the mental health issues you're seeing and also how you're bringing girls together and what impact that has.
Yes, thank you. So the Abriendo Oportunidades program was built on the simple notion of girls coming together once a week in their own communities, in the communities where they live. So it's a very simple exercise, right? That you would think makes a lot of sense, not that expensive to do. But you know, where in all the communities that we were going to, we didn't find girls organized, right? So there was already something about confinement, as we see it, that was keeping girls at home. So when you actually trace back confinement, you have to trace it back to the colonial times. Because women used to have leadership role, Indigenous women used to have more intentional leadership roles that were disrupted by this idea of, no, you stay at home. You're now going to do the cooking, the cleaning, and it is men who are going to be working on the land mostly, and so your place is here, right? So it's a legacy of hundreds of years of hearing the message that you are to be confined. And I think confinement is such a word, you know, it's a word that now scares everyone after the experience that we've had with the pandemic. But just imagine living like that all of your childhood, right? And this idea that's installed within you, that you are not eligible for things, that you're not entitled to do things, right? That you are not even visible in the community leadership space. So, you know, when talking about what these programs do for girls, we often say that the one thing that they offer is a place to discuss their identities. Identity is such a tricky place in an area of thought in Guatemala because, you know, it makes you feel ashamed. Because you've been growing up hearing that if you are Indigenous, you are the cause of the lack of progress that the country has. That if you're Indigenous, then you're fighting for entitlements that, you know, you maybe shouldn't be fighting for because you're already given things, right? And so much of the mental health that I think we don't yet understand from the Indigenous perspective, it's more of a Western idea that we're still dealing with. We need to hear more from the voices of girls, young Indigenous women, and how they talk about violence. But they're in confinement and also in the exclusion that Indigenous communities face, and, you know, this speaks about patriarchy. I also want to raise attention to the fact that Indigenous communities are not violent, right? It's not like men have this idea of perpetrating gender-based violence against women. If it happens, it's because of the lack of information. It's because of the lack of strengthening the Indigenous institutions that in the first place empower you for civil services and the resources, right? Exclusion is such that it can actually make you believe that you shouldn't be there in that community in the first place. So I think, you know, building the core of togetherness, collectiveness, intergenerational connections that are so important in Guatemala because we lost a generation of Indigenous women to the war. And we're not gonna be able to, either take it back or reconnect these girls to these women. But what we can do is bring some of these content into the activities that we do with girls. And by the way, this work in Guatemala has been ongoing for almost 25 years now.
Great. Kelly, I know you're also working on creating networks, and then there have been also surprising connections between people as you've done this work. Can you talk about some of that, some of the surprising ways in which the work has taken a life of its own?
Sure. In addition to the partners where we go through a sort of helpful handbook blueprint for them to reclaim their matrilineal structures. I mean, a lot of them are underlying, but they haven't had the sort of step-by-step way of rebuilding it and sustaining it. We also have our Indigenous Young Leaders cohort, which connects young people between ages 18 and 29 across the country. And a lot of them are doing interesting things together, which we can describe a little more if we have time. But then I also have my Australian sisters, some of whom have to get back to the UNPFII. They're officials there, so thank you for coming. But others in the room too. And I was there in February, and I just really wanted to see how life was for women and girls there. And I made so many fantastic connections, and really we're learning from each other in terms of, how we're getting to self-determination, how we're becoming more sovereign. And so just these sort of connections that are empowering, they're strengthening, and you realize you're not the only one in the fight. And so it's so, it gives me strength, it gives me energy. And so it's amazing in that way.
Wonderful. Angel, in Guatemala, how is it going? How is the government responding to your work? What changes are you seeing?
Well, for those of you that are not familiar, we struggled with democracy in Guatemala over the past quarter. We're feeling hopeful because we have a government that's finally speaking about the debts that we have to Indigenous communities, the failed promises that were made to Indigenous communities, and has given a central space and in the conversation for Indigenous girls. But we also find that it is a time of global connections. It is a government that's really trying to make an effort to reach out and then reach back to try to find examples, to also try to bring some positive energy. And we're lucky enough to have Kelly and the Indigenous Justice Circle here in the US to bring some of that inspiration, right? So we think that we are now at a point where we can start being more intentional, more critical, actually saying what we mean, because in the past years, we had to be very careful about what was negotiated on behalf of girls, on behalf of women, particularly on behalf of Indigenous communities, because the discrimination and exclusion that was very present in the mindset of politicians. We also have a vice president, a woman scientist that believes a lot in the rights of girls, Indigenous women, and so we're hopeful. But we are also in this process of making more intentional connections to those here in the room or elsewhere, even online, that want to connect with the work that we're doing.
And Kelly, Indigenous Justice Circle is a pretty young organization, but I would love to hear you talk about some of the things that you've already done that you're most proud of and excited about.
So I think the most important thing is earning the trust of our partners out in Indian country, because even though I'm a tribal citizen, that doesn't mean I'm part of their tribe. And so it's really having those intentional, ongoing, honest conversations with people across the country and the world for that matter. We have we're trying to rebuild Indigenous systems and reorient mainstream systems to better serve Native American people. And so in building our systems, one of the systems we built, which basically came about because of COVID, but after COVID, we're continuing it, is a network of mentors, Native women mentors, 2 girls across Indian country. We meet every single month. We talk with each other. We talk about joy, sorrow, successes, challenges that we're having. And really, we have become like a national support system for each other and really help do this work, help bring girls' voices to the fore. We have them doing, working in the political spaces, doing voter registration drives, learning how to run for office themselves. Olivia is helping us with this, right? Erica, who's another one of our IYL, she's the environmental leader in Mexico and across Latin America. And so it's really staying in touch and bringing the voices and the passions and the talents of the women that we have with us really to the fore and letting them lead. So that's really how we're being successful.
And before we open it up to questions, what do both of you wish for? And maybe in particular from the people in the room, many of whom it sounds like are already supporting your work in all different ways, but not just funds, but what are the things that the people in this room can think about doing to support your work?
Sure, thank you. So, I think just being connected is really important. Offering the stories of the work that you're doing can also be inspirational for the movement that we're trying to build. In Guatemala, we have worked with close to 500 young Indigenous women who, in turn, have mobilized close to 25,000 girls. Indigenous girls across Guatemala, but also Mexico and Belize. And whenever we talk to them and whenever we get to learn about their expectations, we often hear this idea of they need more resources, they want more resources, they want more history. And I think not more history in terms of how it's been for Indigenous people across the Americas, but also I think we need to remember that for us that are connected to these forums like the UN, that are in the international development field, it's pretty easy to take for granted the history of human rights, social movements, and these groups of girls and young Indigenous women like Elizabeth that you saw in the video are really eager to learn, to be connected. Language still a barrier, but now with all of the tools that we have, I'm sure that can be overcome. So the invitation is to be connected, to learn more, to reach out and ask, and to try to foster collectiveness.
Wonderful. Kelly?
Again, I would agree with Angel that reaching out and asking for our stories, asking us to be part of your forums, have us speak. We have a lot of young people who, as you have seen today, are incredibly articulate, passionate, know what the heck they're talking about. They're the experts in their field. And we just want to have them be connected to opportunities and other mentors. Obviously, we need resources, we need allies, and we need opportunities for faces to be heard.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to open it up to questions from people in the room, or we don't have time for questions. We have a little bit of time for questions. I think one thing I should say is if people need to go because we're supposed to be at the end, you're allowed to leave. We won't look badly upon you.
You want to stay?
But if you would like to stay, I know that these two can stay. I think that Kashmir River can stay and answer questions, and Callie. So let's, take a moment to leave if you need to, and please stay if you'd like to. And please also stay for the corn husk dolls, the doll making activity. So Lisa has the mic, she can bring it to you.
We can also start with it. We can also start with a question from online if nobody wants to be the first person to raise their hand.
And I, of course, have another question if we need one.
Okay, we have a question from Victoria Williams online. In They're asking, are the girls' societies also being developed to assist girls to develop self-protective behaviors in an environment of trafficking and murdered and missing?
Yes. Yes, absolutely, because currently in the US, the murdered and missing Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit crisis is it's starting to be addressed, which is great, but it's much more after something happens to a girl. So it's the judicial, it's the legal, it's the, getting the person into the missing persons databases. But there's a real need to do some preventive upstream stuff too. And so with our girls' societies, we have girls meet every week, and then we know if they don't come, and we know that something has happened to them if they don't come. And so we're hoping that this can be something that's spread more across communities in Indian country. And so it's kind of like an early warning system. So we don't find out months later that something really bad has happened to a girl or Two-Spirit or a boy for that matter. So that's our approach is preventive.
How about somebody in the room? Oh,
Rhonda.
no,
I know you have to walk over.
I can walk over.
Hi everyone, Rana Lapine with Grantmakers for Growth of Color. So excited, thank you for holding this. I have a question for some of the young folks who talked. At G4GC, we talk a lot about like seeding power, both SEED as in like sort of opportunities for building leadership, and then also CEDE, right, of like yielding power to young people. I'm curious if you would mind stating some ways that you kind of wish folks who either you're in community with or people you're working with would be ceding power to you or to young people you're working with, and what some opportunities might be for us to maybe step back to let you all have a little bit more leadership. Yala.
So, that is very different from that. So a really big part of our program is that it is youth driven. So obviously we are there to provide support in whatever way that is. But we most of the time let the youth decide what we're doing for the day, how they want to spend their time. I think as a society, we tend to think of our youth as being kids and needing to constantly be guided, but really they're humans, they're small adults. They need to be given the opportunities to be able to decide what to do within their community and not just told directly, this is what we're doing today. So I think just having the support of the community is really important to let them grow into being the people that they're trying to become is probably foundational to that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think in my mind, the first thing I thought of is the role of a Wintibokan or somebody who's a clown. And the reason why I thought of this is because the best voices in our community that have supported youth in my mind are those people who aren't afraid to speak and aren't afraid of judgment. Even if somebody supports a cause, right, whether it be IMAGEN or supporting youth or supporting Two-Spirit people, there are a lot of silent supporters in our community, and I love those people. But the people who have made the most change that I've seen are those people who aren't afraid to say it loud and to get in somebody's face and say that this is wrong, or, this needs to be changed, or I like what you're doing. Being a powerful voice like that has a lot of change, at least in my community. And I really look up to those women and those matriarchs who I consider mentors who have done that, because they've always made me feel safe. They've always shown me that it's okay to be bold, because in our way, we're taught to listen to elders and to not contradict and to not talk back. But there needs to be a role for that clown, that Wintibokan, that person who speaks and is allowed to kind of break the rules a little bit and say, what you did was fucked up, or I think we should change this next year. has a lot of power, and it's what makes youth feel safe. It lets them know that it's okay to break away and that they won't be shunned.
Are there more questions in the room or comments?
Hi, my name is Minar. I'm also affiliated with G4GC like Rana. I had a question. It's open to all the speakers, but I was wondering how y'all feel about adopting a global framework when working within your community. So if that is within the scope of your work, thinking beyond locally and thinking within a global framework, like if you're a North American tribe working with someone, probably in Palestine or in the Polynesian area, just stuff like that.
So I worked a lot globally, and so this resonates with me, having just come back to Indian country in the last 7 or so years. I think there was an undervaluing of a sort of global perspective, and I don't think it's being driven by a global framework, but it's being informed by what's happening globally and of global frameworks that are either in place or being developed and being part of that conversation. And it may not fit your community or your situation, but it's probably something that's relevant to the struggle that you're going through, on the ground yourself. And so I think there's space for those forums and convenings and conversations, and not necessarily to be driven by them, but to be part of them.
If I may offer some thought on that, I think we need to connect more intentionally the groups that we work with the foundational spirit of human rights. We still need to believe that these mechanisms to protect, uphold, raise awareness, visibility on the rights of Indigenous women and girls are important. And in particular, in Guatemala, where it's been so hard to get to places where you have Indigenous institutions, for example, that are led by Indigenous women, that offer protection for Indigenous women. Those exist because of the recommendations that are put forward in these spaces, like the UN Permanent Forum. So I think for those of you that actually have that opportunity to participate in these spaces, to actually offer opinion recommendation, it's really important that we not lose the momentum and be more intentional to talk about girls and women and two-spirit youth. In Guatemala, I cannot tell you how important it has been, these mechanisms that lead to court orders that allow Indigenous midwives to actually demand the rights they are entitled to, the financial mechanisms they should deserve to actually be able to provide the services, the community services that they provide to half of the population. So I would say that please raise your voices whenever you can. Speak on behalf of Indigenous youth girls whenever you can, and reach out if you need case studies, examples, data that we can provide.
I think my mind went to the work of one of my sisters in Nez Perce tribe who runs Nez Perce Tourism, and it's kind of part of our cultural resources program. And the reason I think of this is because one of the missions has been interacting in a diplomatic way with other Indigenous nations across the world, and kind of making sure that we give recognition to each other, because even in the US context, it's important that we as tribes recognize each other. And in the global context, I think as Indigenous nations, we would rather recognize who are the people that are on this land, who come from it, rather than a colonial government. And as someone who works in earth science, I've tried to do this. It's been a really big part of my mind around it. If I'm looking at soils or rocks or doing studies on a mining site or something like this, whose land does that site occupy? And I would rather hear from them than the colonial government that might be there. And I think, in the context that you're talking about, it really does require that. And I've seen some tribes do this, recognize that those Indigenous people directly to them, not going through a colonial middleman in any way. And that's how we build sovereignty together as tribal nations or Indigenous nations across the world. And I think that's key. So for those who have resources, you should support those sort of missions and support those connections. That's what global sovereignty looks like for Indigenous people.
So I think we're running a little bit low on time, so I saw Judith raise her hand, and so I'm gonna walk over to her as someone who has plenty of experience in many of the things we've been talking about today to either say some final words or perhaps ask a final question.
Well, I'll hide my question in the statement. And this is a wonderful lead-in. Assuming this is yes and, in other words, the previous speakers, river speakers, about whatever decisions the variety of Indigenous groups are going to make, which is theirs to make. There is an international structure, it's called the Sustainable Development Goals right now. I think they're being articulated at national rather than subnational or even subnation levels. And there may be an opportunity there. And the piece of history that I'm especially interested in is we're very proud that we were able to provide some space for the development of these here at the Council, Girls Center. And the original question was a human rights question. Who's at the greatest risk of the worst outcomes at the youngest ages? Because problematically, human rights is not an allocation tool. Everybody has them, they're indivisible. And often it can be used as cover, and many of the scale plans Kelly, you spoke about, were put forward, actually, I don't know, possibly also what you spoke about, were scale plans that somehow put some foothold in some notional human rights, but not ones that were articulated at the levels you're talking about. So the question then is, and it's marvelous that there's this affiliation with the United Nations, articulating sustainable development goals through whatever process seems relevant at what seems to be the level of identified community, which is a very strong factor. And just one aside, and I will say nothing more. When I first visited the Pine Ridge Reservation, there was a statue to a man, and it said something you would never see in any museum I've ever been in. And it says, we honor him because he puts community before family, because family has become code for self, and wellness has become code for self. And I've only heard in one setting in my life that everybody in your community is called your relative. That is a unique contribution. So what possibilities are there, blending traditional and modern theme here, of having an articulation at a community level, as you define it, of the Sustainable Development Goals for Indigenous peoples, plural?
So in the United States, federally recognized tribes are their own nations. And so we could each do our own national SDG map or study. But even within that, we need to disaggregate, because if we look at data in terms of access to resources, access to credit, financial well-being, women have much more access than Native men do, access to jobs, different things like that. So I think there's certainly a space for an exercise to do with the Indigenous communities here in the US. So I'll let Angel speak to the Central American state of affairs.
Yeah, Judith, your questions are. So I would say that to me it's very simple, and it's about political participation space for the political participation of the new generations of Indigenous women. They need to get to the institutions, shape them up. They have the knowledge, they have the skills, they have the information, they are connected to their communities, and we just need to move. Now, in order for that to happen, particularly in Guatemala, we need to keep on insisting that we are not doing enough. Of 160 seats in Congress, we only have one Indigenous woman, one, in a country where half of the population is Indigenous. So this is only going to happen with long-term commitments to places, specific places, because that's how Indigenous communities live and have lived historically. And it's also why we insist on the intergenerational component of our work. So, we need to get better at the funding mechanisms, at understanding that long-term investments are usually not the norm, but very logical in the Indigenous worldviews, and it's going to be the only way to actually get to the place where we want to be in terms of reshaping these global commitments.
And Kelly has some closing remarks, and then Columbia's thoughts. Or I think she's break.
So thank you for staying. I think we're way over time. I don't have to watch on you, but so I just want to take this opportunity to thank all of our speakers, moderator Marianne. Thank you so much. Thanks to those who asked questions, those who wanted to ask questions didn't have an opportunity to. I think the most important group I want to thank first is our Indigenous-led partners, the Redmi and Nalabak networks of Mayan women mentors in Guatemala, who most of them came up as girls through the Abriendo Oportunidades program. So thank you. Keep going, stay strong. We'll support you however we can. Native American Community Services of Erie and Niagara counties, who Kashmir works with. The Oklahoma City Indian Clinic, serving urban natives from scores of tribes in the Oklahoma area. The Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe in Minnesota, Pine County, Minnesota Department of Health and Human Services, White Buffalo Calf Women's Society in the Rosebud Sioux Reservation, Bluebird Cultural Initiative serving native urban people in Omaha, Nebraska, Thunder Valley Community Development on the Pine Ridge Reservation, the Keweenaw Bay Indian Community of the Lake Superior Band of Chippewa Indians. Our advisors, Gwen Packard, who's the Hunkawam Tagoda, Janet Routson, who's Rosebud Sioux, Amy Pond, who's Oglala, Eva Roca, who's of Cherokee descent, Willeen Johnson, who is Miccosukee descent, and the indomitable Judith Bruce, who's one of our best allies. The young leaders who are here who spoke, but also Erika, who Cabillo Ramirez, who's here for the UNPFII, Olivia Gerling-Lease, who's here working on our political participation work, our donors, the Ford Foundation, Marty Jiven, Summit Foundation, the For Good Fund, the Jerry Cunningham family, Dr. Estelle Bender, Flora Family Foundation, the PAD Project, Tinker Foundation, Rockefeller Brothers Fund, Coca-Cola FEMSA, and the Wellspring Philanthropic Fund, and many individuals who are in this room. Thank you. And last but not least, I want to give credit to the people who made this event happen: Cassell, Sherry, Lisa Poland, Juanita, Gordon, Joe Schaefer, and then finally to the council leadership, Twino, Jim Saylor, and Pat Bond, if they're still here. So thank you so much for coming, and I hope you have a great afternoon, either with us or out in the sunshine. Thank you.